Professor Diesen, thank you so much for finding some time for us. It's a pleasure. It's an honor to have you. My name is Arthur Khachikyan. It's a little difficult to pronounce in English. Just call me Arthur.
Sure.
All right.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Right. I've been following a lot of your commentary and a lot of your interviews, and I completely sympathize and share your views. We just have a few questions regarding the global situation and also the situation in our region. I know you've been talking to our colleagues at GRUNC, so you probably are a little bit familiar with what's happening in, around our little republic here. But if you don't mind, we can start with kind of like a big picture vision of what's happening in the world. So this is my recurrent theme. I always say, you know, in late 80s, early 90s, we had statesmen who had a holistic, systemic vision of the world, who tried to build one Europe, one world, one security architecture. Then it all fell apart. Now with Trump coming to power, with his declaring an era of peace, wanting to be the president of peace, stopping the war unrealistically in 24 hours, do you think there is a chance that there will be a return to a more systemic, all-inclusive vision of Europe, of European security, which in turn will give us an opportunity to end this horrible war and this bloodshed in Ukraine?
Well, it's a bit unclear what Trump is actually going for, and I think this is why I am a bit confused as well, because even the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio suggested that the age of unipolarity was over. They had to adjust to multipolarity. So the question then begs, well, what do they think multipolarity entails? Because I would agree that abandoning the unipolar project is the most important thing at the time, because it's worth, again, taking a step back, realizing what this entailed. Because for the past centuries, whenever we talked about security, we meant we had to recognize the security competition, that is the security dilemma. If country A increases its security, it comes at the expense of country C, they retaliate, and then everything goes down. So my point is therefore that security always entails that you also have to take into account the security concerns of your adversaries, which is why from the Helsinki Accords all the way up till the 90s, we talked about indivisible security. Yes. You can't divide it. If you deny security to one, you won't have security for anyone. So this was the basic idea. But the unipolar order is based on a very different premise. In this premise, it's not that you have to take into account your adversary. It's the idea that one side will be so dominant that others can't even think about challenging it. And this is what defined the US security strategy. This is more or less what they wrote into their strategic documents. And this is, for example, in the 90s when we decided, as you said, to walk away from this common European security architecture. The reasoning that was given was, well, the Russians are weak, we don't have any opponents. Yep. Who can check us? And I think that this is worth recognizing, because instead of taking into account their security concerns, the idea was it doesn't matter anymore what they think. We're going to be so overwhelmingly dominant. And the problem was that this was always destined to be a very temporary phenomenon. That is, over time, the empire as it is would begin to exhaust its resources, while new centers of powers would emerge, which would then collectively balance. So we reached that point now, and for a while it looked like the US was trying to, go back to the 90s. They were going to defeat the Russians on the battlefield, cut off their energy resources. They were going to cripple the Chinese tech development, but it turns out they're not able to do this. So when the Trump administration began to suggest they're adjusting to multipolarity, I would hope that this will translate into traditional security. We'll look into the interest of our adversaries as well to have a common peace. But instead, it seems that some of the idea is they would like the US still to be very dominant, just that they have to recognize they can't go after, for example, both the Chinese and the Russians at the same time. So I think this is where we're at now, where they're preparing a new America, a bit of a retrenchment, where they're not gonna, because they have to reprioritize in a world where they're not dominant. But that means at the home front they have to, well, for example, strengthen in South America, Central America, maybe get Greenland, strengthen their Arctic footprint. So I see it being a very confrontational and aggressive interpretation of what multipolarity could be. So it really depends what they have in mind.
Well, yes, I quite agree. And in fact, it's interesting that you mentioned the security dilemma. I always talk about it with my students. Isn't it funny that some of our world leaders who seem to be very educated people and have educated advisors, I mean, it's an elementary concept that they don't seem to think about. Well, multipolarity can be as I'm sure you know, and you've been speaking about this. There are different ways of handling it. One is kind of a military maintenance of balance of power, where you're checking the power of the other states with force, by military force. And then the other one, like the Concert of Europe, where it's maintained diplomatically. And that's what we would hope to have, an equilibrium that's equilibrium-oriented thinking versus versus domination-oriented thinking. But I agree with you now, it's kind of a mixed picture. It's a little bit of a retrenchment, America first, but selective domination in selective regions. I mean, that's what it seems to be coming to. In that light, what do you think may one expect from from this recent news that Trump is talking to Putin? I think yesterday or the day before he confirmed that he is talking to Putin, and there are 3 options for the peace settlement in Ukraine that have been proposed. I mean, obviously we can't know every detail, but approximately what can it look like given what Ukraine said it wants and what Russia said it wants?
Well, first, I would just say I agree. I think the multipolar system can be upheld either diplomatically or militarily. But given that after the Industrial Revolution and globalization, we have economic interdependence, it's also economic multipolarity. That is, when one state becomes too economically dependent on another state, they will seek to diversify or create some degree of autonomy. Mm-hmm. And we see this. I mean, Russia's most important partner state now is China. But still, they don't want China to become overwhelmingly dominant, which is why they're diversifying. They're trying also to lean towards India and other countries. So the multipolar system can sustain itself. The main problem is a lot of these impulses we have. For example, when the Europeans cut their ties to Russia, well, now the Russians will lean heavier towards China. When we're pressuring the Indians to cut their ties with Iran, well, now Iran will lean closer to China. So a lot of what we're doing is we're disrupting the natural rebalancing of the international system. So I think this is problematic. Now, Trump's peace proposal, I'm assuming, given his main concerns, so primarily that this could take us to a third world war, a nuclear exchange. He says he's worried about the death of all the young men. Okay, we can assume this is genuine. But overall, it's also the fear that this is all pushing Russia towards China. And ideally, he would want Russia on our side of the ledger. This was his whole argument back in 2016 as well, when he said it would be good to get along with Russia. So it's very much based on the idea of Kissinger. Don't let these two giants come together, especially if they both feel threatened by the United States. However, it was interpreted across the West as being some kind of a secret agent of Russia. Like, there was no other interpretation of this. So of course it didn't work. But in order to resolve the Ukraine crisis, I think the main formula would have to be obviously restoring Ukraine's neutrality. If you recognize that we can't dominate Europe, that the largest country in Europe still has to have a role, then we have to put a stop to NATO expansion. Because, again, unipolarity, the hegemonic system, NATO was a manifestation of this. This is why we walked away from all the agreements for pan-European security architecture and instead began to expand NATO, where the largest country in Europe would also be the only country without a voice on the continent. So, sorry, this is what has caused a lot of our conflict. So he recognizes this. He's even pointed it out with a conversation with journalists, suggesting that it was always understood you don't expand NATO into Ukraine. This would trigger a war. You know, he called it a Biden error. That is a problem of Biden. But this has been a consistent thing in U.S. policy for the past 30 years. So I think any peace agreement will have to recognize that Ukraine would have to be a neutral state. Now, and that would have been enough. That's what the Russians were going for in early 2022 as well, as we learned from the Istanbul negotiations. Sorry. That is, Russia would withdraw its troops, and in return, Ukraine would restore its neutrality. But now, of course, the demands are much higher. They want the Russians are very fearful of a long war. That simply NATO will seek to boost its industrial production, have a temporary ceasefire, and then restart the war again. Because what NATO gained in Ukraine is a huge country with hundreds of thousands of soldiers who they can fight the Russians with, what the American leaders are often referring to. So anyways, now they want what's called Istanbul Plus, which is neutrality for Ukraine plus territorial concessions. And the territorial concessions are very important in case NATO changes its mind and decide to go after Russia again. So I think that's the main formula.
Yes. Do you see any Ukrainian leader, Zelensky or otherwise? I mean, he may go, he may be replaced. Do you see any Ukrainian leader signing an agreement whereby Kherson, Zaporozhye, Lugansk, Donetsk, and Crimea become part of Russia, and accepting demilitarization of Ukraine and neutrality for Ukraine? Can any Ukrainian leader sign that, do you think?
I think it's going to be very hard, especially for Zelensky, because he's been making such grand statements, and and also his expectations that seem to be so detached from reality.
Yes.
Again, he wants 200,000 American and European troops guarding the Ukrainian border, which would effectively make them a de facto NATO member state. Now, Russia invaded to prevent this from happening. So a peace agreement in which Russia is winning, it obviously can't have this as a solution. They also want promises. He also wants promises of NATO membership in the future. All of this, so none of this can actually happen. Now, regarding Zelensky, I think he would probably have to go at some point. The Russians don't think they can deal with him. But they put question mark whether any deal they sign with him would be contested later on, given that his presidential term has expired. And so, but also don't like how he accommodated the far right, how he undermined the language rights, religious rights, political rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. So I think from the American side, this is being met to some extent. They recognize that perhaps Zelensky is unrealistic, and also that the Russians don't accept him. So Kellogg has suggested that perhaps, not perhaps, that there has to be elections again in Ukraine. Now, given that Zelensky is very unpopular, this suggests that he will have to go. So it depends who will replace him. But I think that it will be very hard for any future Ukrainian leader to swallow, because this is a terrible deal. They will have lost hundreds of thousands of men. Millions have fled the country. They will have lost about 20% of the country. The rest has been destroyed. The energy infrastructure, I mean, they suffered greatly over the past 3 years. And not only will they have to accept all these losses, but any peace agreement would effectively be based on no future NATO membership, neutrality, and also any security guarantees. I can't imagine what they would be, because the main problem with a peace agreement, if you want it to last, you can't have incentives for restarting the war. Now, if restarting the war would pull in the West, as a security guarantee suggests, then there would be too much incentives to restart the conflict in order to get the West back in and then get back what you wanted to begin with. So I don't think there will be, Ukraine would have to be neutral. There's not going to be any security guarantees. They would have to accept mass territorial losses. And at the end of the day, the Americans might actually strip them of a lot of their resources as well, which they want as assistance. And furthermore, the Russians have taken a lot of the resources as well, because most of the natural resources are concentrated in the east. So it's going to be a very devastating and humiliating peace for the Ukrainians. So how can they accept it? Well, I guess if they see every day they're losing more men and more territories being lost to the Russians, the deal is not your ideal peace versus what the Russians are proposing, but it's going to be this deal, which is bad, or even a worse one if you wait a few months when Ukraine might collapse. So I think it would be a humiliating peace, but I don't think this is necessarily good for anyone, not even the Russians either, because you don't want humiliating peace which you can't live with in the long term. And I think this is deeply problematic. But at the end of the day, it's the Americans that are keeping Ukraine afloat. So if they decide to end the war, Washington can end it, and so they can put immense pressure on Zelensky. So I think this will be to a large extent, a deal between the US and the Russians, because the Europeans aren't really that relevant anymore. Also, they didn't do any, they ignored all diplomacy for 3 years, and now they look more interested in sabotaging it. And meanwhile, Zelensky seems very unrealistic. So I think the US and Russians will come together, they more or less have a common understanding and impose it. At least that's how I read it now. But yeah, I could be wrong.
In that regard, there's been a polling statement, a very honest but a very appalling statement by Rubio with regard to that. He said that we lied to these people, giving them hope that they could win against Russia. I mean, it's very honorable of him to say this openly, but it's an appalling thing to say, because the number of casualties, according to some sources, has now surpassed 1,200,000 people. It's a catastrophe. It's a human tragedy, unprecedented tragedy, and I think Boris Johnson and Zelensky will have a lot of questions to ask themselves. Regarding, we'll move on from the subject, but regarding the peace settlement, I think the challenge would be to come up with a settlement that will not be just a truce, like Marshal Foch said after World War I, not to have a time bomb, because yes, Ukraine can promise to be neutral. Finland and Sweden were neutral. They're not neutral now. So there will have to be some mechanism that will not trigger another war. And Russians certainly understand that if the war stops, the West will turn Ukraine into a massive base, and it will be rearmed. And now the fear factor isn't there, because if you remember when the war started, some forecasts, even from Washington, claimed that Russia will be in Kiev in a few days. And now it's a very, very different picture, which makes it even more dangerous for the war to erupt again. But anyway, moving to our region. We've been following also the events around Iran. I'm sure you have been following these events. What do you think Trump will do with Iran? Because number one, he promised that he will negotiate with Iran as firmly as possible. I don't remember his exact formula, but he said tough negotiations basically is what he promised. On the other hand, we're hearing that the military option is on his table, the military attack, Israel followed by the United States, probably against the nuclear targets. And then we hear from the Republican Guard that this is the time for Iran to get a nuclear bomb to deter Israel. What do you think is going to happen here? Because we are neighbors. We're right next to Iran, and there will be some important consequences for Armenia.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. Do you mind if I just
Sure.
a brief comment on
Sure,
the
sure.
last issue with Ukraine? Because
Sure.
they have this narrative building up that they were stabbed in the back by the West, and I don't really disagree with this, because keep in mind that in the beginning of 2022, they were more or less they had a deal with the Russians, which they already started to speak about on the first day of the Russian invasion, which was as we discussed, neutrality in return for Russia leaving. Now, at this point, Zelensky even gave an interview to The Economist and was pointing out that, a lot of the Western states want a long war instead. They don't want this war to end. They want a long war because then they can bleed the Russians, even if this means the destruction of Ukraine. So he suggested that in March of 2022, this is not something they would want. But of course, the British and Americans approached him, and they said, if you're willing to fight the Russians, you can have everything. You can get NATO membership. You'll have a severely weakened Russia. And will effectively make you Churchill, as we saw they were able to do in the media. So make him a big hero, the one who finally defeated the Russians after Napoleon and Hitler. Anyways, this is what they were sold, and this is why they went with the long war. But instead, as Zelensky himself recognized, Ukraine became destroyed, and there was no real prospect of defeating the Russians. How do you defeat the world's largest nuclear power when the nuclear power sees this as being a fight for its survival, its sheer existence? So I'm very happy Rubio said what he said, because at least in this country, in Norway, they still hold on to the same narrative. That is, the Ukrainians hardly have any casualties. The Russians have huge casualties. All these narratives, they can still win. They believe that this is a moral thing to say, to an expression of support. And if you say the opposite, no, actually Ukraine's taking huge losses, then it's met with suspicions. Why would you say that? Are you trying to, it's seen as being anti-Ukrainian or pro-Russian, that you're trying to undermine the war effort. But I see it very different. Again, this is the narrative we created for a long war. The reason why we pretend they're taking a few losses, we're pretending they can still win even now when they they're finished, exhausted, is because we want to continue the war, even though it leads to all this death and all this losses and destruction of Ukraine. So I see it as being crazy, huge, immensely immoral, and using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder and selling it as something moral, as support, as if we care about the Ukrainians. So I find it to be rather disgusting
I could not agree
when I
more.
hear them
I could not
speak
agree
about
more.
supporting Ukraine in this moral way. When you see the countries being destroyed, majority of Ukrainians want negotiations, and we still talk about support as being sending weapons. For me, it's beyond disgusting. But
I could not
anyways, you
agree more.
asked about Iran.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to throw that in there.
Well, let me
So,
throw something else. In IR theory, it's called balancing wars. And Britain has been the master of balancing in Europe for the last 400 years, according to Winston Churchill. If you take that one source, of course, there are many others. So cynically, to use one country to weaken another country is a very common thing to do in international relations. But cynically, very cynically and disgustingly, as you said, 1,200,000 people have to pay with their lives. And I don't know if we'll ever find out the real numbers because it's constantly being manipulated politically. Anyway, please go ahead.
yeah, that was Dostoevsky made this argument as well, that was the British policy in Eastern Europe to make the Slavs hate the Russians as much as the British did. But it's not that much. I don't buy this argument about hating Slavs. I think it's more, as you said, it's about the divide and rule.
Yeah,
That is, you
balance, yeah.
prevent the rise of a hegemon by turning the main powers against each other. This is why the Americans and British always try to keep the Germans and the Russians separated and hate each other rather than cooperate. And the same now with the Chinese, of course. Now,
Right.
but in terms of Iran, I guess I'm also a bit cautious to look in a crystal ball on this one, because it's Trump's way of doing politics, which is interesting. He throws out these extreme, provocative statements that shakes up everything, and then I think he gives himself some room to maneuver. That is, once you suggested, for example, that you're gonna ethnically cleanse Gaza and take ownership, suddenly you widen the scope for what can be done, and in this instance he can achieve many things. Netanyahu could stay in power. Suddenly the Israeli war doesn't look like a loss, and there's as many things you can achieve, but also you can put pressure on the Arab neighbors. Either do you want us to ethnically cleanse and this 2 million Palestinians to your countries and make it into an American Riviera, or are you willing to make some concessions? So I think it could be a negotiation tactic. It could be a way of saving Netanyahu. It could be simply America trying to appear strong at a time where it's actually pursuing some retrenchment strategy. But the Iran question is interesting because Israel has a huge influence, as we know, over U.S. foreign policy, and they've been over time. They always do the same. They do this mowing the lawn in Palestine. They every now and then go to war against Lebanon. They also want to weaken Syria. Now toppled it, of course, but the main power, which is seen to put a check on Israel and indeed threaten it as well, is Iran. And so, of course, but the Israelis can't defeat Iran on its own. It needs the United States. But this would be a disastrous war. And furthermore, you can't really defeat Iran. Yes, you can blow up some of their nuclear power plants and nuclear where they're having these nuclear sites, but if you attack Iran, it will only convince it that it needs nuclear weapon as a deterrent. Indeed, this is what many might have been concerned, that by trying to weaken Hamas and Hezbollah, that the Iranians would feel isolated and then rely on nuclear weapons. They say nuclear weapons is the ultimate equalizer. So who knows? I'm not going to say that Iran might not feel that vulnerable, that they might seek to acquire this. But what is Trump going to do? I do think his instinct of reducing America's footprint, that is avoiding these forever wars. I think I think that's probably what it's going to act upon. And indeed, a war against Iran, it will be such a disaster that I think he would avoid it. But it's the rhetoric. It's this bluster. I think he's. I often compared it Trump to Nixon in terms of applying this madman theory. That is, if you think Nixon pointed out, if you think that he's mad, that he's unpredictable and might do crazy things, all his opponents will be very cautious, afraid to provoke him, and by this he can take some advantage, and no one will try to climb up the escalatory ladder and up and down. So I think this might be what he's aiming for. But the dark side of this is when you're very unpredictable, you trigger a lot of security competition in the region, and this is Iran has every reason in the world now. Should they just sit and wait, decide whether or not the Trump will bomb them? Of course, they will start to take measures, and as they enhance their security, the Israeli might see this as undermining theirs, and we might suddenly see an escalation, which Trump didn't necessarily expect or want. So an accidental war being pulled in or lured in by the Israelis is possible. But I think initially Trump does not want this.
Right. No, it's an interesting point. Can you be an irrational actor in a deterrence mechanism? There's a IR debate about it, as you know, but there are certain risks, and I'm certainly hoping that it will not come to a war because it will have devastating consequences for the region. I don't even know that it'll be better for Israel to create this massive instability. I mean, we don't know what will happen in Syria. We've just seen some pretty unprecedented events. A leader of Al-Qaeda's offshoot, al-Nusra, brought to power with Western blessing, and then Western dignitaries meeting him, shaking his hand after he had a makeover, like in some kind of a teenage movie. He just had a makeover and became an acceptable partner for us. Like, what is this? I mean, I no longer know what to say. When was the last time we had a Western leader or an American leader who openly discussed ethnic cleansing of close to 2 million people? I just don't know. This is a very curious historical period. Now, coming to our region, Iran, by the way, is a few hundred kilometers away from here. I think it's like 200 kilometers, so it's pretty close to us. In our region, as you know, there have been a series of conflicts. We had a war with our neighbor in 2020. So there was an alliance of Turkey, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, and Israel, basically. If you consider material aid, if you consider all the jihadists they brought, they prevailed over this region, ethnically Armenian region of Karabakh, which has been depopulated, and the world obviously immediately forgot about it. Do you think that in this region, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, the three big powers, or Turkey as they want to be called now, do you think that there will be some kind of an equilibrium that these countries will sustain, or will this be competition? And do you think that Russia will gradually withdraw from this region and leave it to Turkish domination?
Well, I think. First, sorry, that's just one comment on what you said last about the Palestinian issue, and I think. Yeah. One of the fascinating things is not just that now the American president has spoken openly about ethnically cleansing Gaza, but that this is now appropriate. But it also signals really the most any American president has ever done in terms of rejecting the two-state solution. And this is very dramatic because if you recognize there can only be one state, a Jewish state, then you have to recognize within this greater Israel area that the Jews are only half the population, which means if you reject the two-state solution, what is the option? You only have then either ethnic cleansing, you kick out the non-Jews, the Arabs, the Palestinians of the region, or you have an apartheid state where, yes, we have a Jewish state plus these people who don't have the same rights as us, which is the other half of the population. And there's no other real solutions. Unless, either ethnic cleansing, genocide, or apartheid. If you're going to have one state where half the population is not part of the Jewish nation state, so it's quite a dramatic thing to do. But
I quite agree.
But again, it shows that this liberal view of the Western policies have begun to drop a bit. I think this was a luxury we had through the 90s. Every time we use force, power bomb, Yugoslavia and everyone else, we can dress it up as being, a humanitarian exercise. We just really cared about these people here. It's not about reorganizing the Balkans, and it's all about human rights. And we've invaded Afghanistan, occupied for 20 years. Oh, we want little girls to go to school. So we're selling these silly narratives as if the great powers occupy Central Asia, the strategic region, for 20 years because they really wanted girls to go to school. But we've been selling these stories. But I think some of this is falling apart now as the dominance, the hegemon weakens. So, for example, Nagorno-Karabakh, this was an interesting thing. If you looked at the Western media when this is happening, like people who lived there for centuries being cleansed of the region, and the media seem to be, how this going to affect Russia? They're going to look weak now. I mean, this is,
Wow.
it was, yeah, it was a bit absurd to see an ethnic cleansing being referred to in this way.
This is the
But
Western media. This is the European media reflecting, like presenting it as an issue of weakening Russia.
no, that there was a weakness of Russia.
Oh, yeah.
What could they do? Indeed, this was always the idea as well, that if Azerbaijan and Armenia clash, what is Russia going to do? Because on one hand, it's if you can't protect Armenia, but then it has to go against the Azerbaijanis. Anyways, it can't keep both relations if they clash. So I think there's been an effort, and it's not very well hidden, of what the main interest that is, especially of the United States and the EU as an extension of it now. I think is the main interest in Armenia is obviously to pull it towards the Western orbit. So this is seen as being a zero-sum weakening of Russia.
But no one is talking
And
about the fact that 120,000 people were ethnically cleansed. I don't think they are.
no,
I don't think anybody noticed it.
no, that's why you don't want too much focus on the humanitarian disaster if this is seen as a geopolitical victory. And this was seen as a necessity to pull Armenia and Azerbaijan as well to some extent away from Russia. Now, I think the international distribution of power is shifting to some extent, but these main three powers in that part of the world, which is the Russians, Iranians, and the Turks, I think there would have to be a rebalancing. The Soviet Union is gone. I don't think. I think the Russians aren't demanding a sphere of influence in terms of exclusive influence. I think they want a sphere of interest in which which would be a different concept in which other great powers operating on its borders would have to take into account its main interests. So in other words, I think they imagine or envision Turkey, Iran, and Russia at least consulting with each other when they engage in that region. And I think that could work for Turkey as well. That is, I think there would be a bit apprehensive to invite the Americans and the Europeans into that region, given that their interests are not always the same. But of course, it's hard to say. Russia and Iran, of course, these days they get along very well. It fits very well within their north-south corridor as well to cooperate in this region. Turkey is always a bit of a wild card because they often seem more accommodating and more pragmatic as opposed to the more ideological West, which always wants to liberate every region from Russian cooperation or influence. But there's also a little bit distrust. I think Erdogan is seen as being very treacherous. He makes a lot of agreements and deals, but they're not really worth that much.
After Syria?
So, yeah, especially Syria. Again, I think he sees this as very clever geopolitics that he tricks other, but in the long run, all the trust will be gone. And if you can't sign any deals with anyone anymore without trust, which is a good lubricant in geopolitics that makes it easier to do deals, they will have to. There's less things you can agree with Turkey in the future. So, and again, this was not the first time Turkey broke deals. We had the same with the Azov commanders, which Russia captured in Mariupol,
Right.
and they were sent to Turkey, and the deal was they were going to not be released before the end of the war. Again, Turkey did it anyways, and after a while, their ability to play this diplomatic role, it kind of goes away. But as to be said, that Turkey is at least aiming to establish itself as an independent pole of power. So it's seen as being more accommodating and pragmatic than the Western Bloc. But that does mean that Turkey is always an honest broker and a partner that is easy to deal with. And that's, again, the long story of Russia-Turkey relations through the centuries. They always had a lot of conflicts, but at least it's seen that it's possible to work with them to resolve this.
Right. And I don't know how much you're following some of the details of local politics, but there is this issue of the Zangezur corridor. As you know, there is a part of Azerbaijan in the Khachikyan region, and then there is the mainland Azerbaijan, and there's an Armenian region. It's about 30 to 40 kilometers wide that separates the two. And Azerbaijan has been putting pressure on us to open this corridor, extraterritorial corridor, which means we can't stop the cargo, we can't check what it is. So it's effectively becoming outside. It's being placed outside of Armenian sovereignty. And our leader recently, during his trip to Washington, and even earlier, he's hinting at the possibility of yielding this corridor to Azerbaijan, which would cut us off from Iran. We basically will be encircled. The only other country would be Georgia. And Iran has expressed its strong opposition to this corridor, saying that it will not accept any territorial changes and that there are other options, for example, going through Iranian territory. Do you think that Iran will be able to oppose the pressure from Turkey and Azerbaijan regarding this corridor?
I'm not sure, but well, from my perspective, it shows some of the self-destructive policies that Pashinyan been pushing in Armenia, because it's two of its really close friends or allies, someone who actually have a very overlapping interest, tends to be Russia and Iran. Not the same, and indeed, I would also advise for Iran and not to rely excessively on Russia and Iran, that they should diversify their ties. But if you've seen what Armenia has done now over the past years, it's weakened Russia and Iran in that region, and its ties, severed a lot of these ties with Armenia in this effort seemingly to tilt into the Western orbit, that this has to be done. But in the process, Armenia has really strengthened the hand of both Turkey and Azerbaijan, which are definitely no friends of Armenia, and will continue to make the position of Armenia even weaker. Now, this in this interest to pivot into the Western orbit, I think it's worth taking and thinking about what the Western interest is in Armenia. And again, it is to decouple it, to bring it into our side of the ledger. That is to cut it a bit away from Iran, cut it a bit away from Russia. So of course, severing this corridor makes sense. To make Armenia excessively then dependent on the West. So this is not something I think Armenia should do. Ideally, I would see Armenia diversifying its ties, so a bit to Russia, Iran, the Western countries, even Turkey. But ideally in the future, better relations with Azerbaijan as well. But this is not what's being achieved. It's that the main interest is for Armenia to choose. It has to align with the West. If it aligns with the West, it has to cut itself off from the others. So I think this is a very dangerous place to be. And again, I think to this regard, it's reasonable to make some comparison between Armenia as well as with Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia. That is, these are all countries now, maybe less so with Armenia, but seem to be on the borders or dividing lines in a divided Europe. They have to be either on one side or the other. And in this regard, there will be a lot of language of morality and virtue, but at the end of the day, the main objective is to make sure that Armenia is on the right side, gravitating towards the right pole. And I think this is a disaster, especially for Armenia, as I mentioned, which has strong intro. If it pivots to the West, my simple point is it will weaken Russia and Iran, which have more common interest with Armenia, and it will strengthen Turkey and Azerbaijan, which will be a disaster, which has already seen for Armenia. So I think this is a huge problem.
I could not agree more, and I appreciate your saying that. There's a very important point, and your opinion will be very valuable. You're a European academic, you live in Norway, very familiar with discourses taking place in Europe and in the United States. So a huge part of the Soros-sponsored, Western-sponsored propaganda machine in Armenia, like tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into this huge propaganda machine, dozens and dozens of media channels, YouTube channels, Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts, etc. All of it aimed at conveying the following point. If you want a good life, break up with Russia and Iran, come to the West. You will become part of Europe. You will become part of the European Union. We just conducted a referendum. You will become part of NATO. France will defend you against Turkey and Azerbaijan. America will defend you against Turkey and Azerbaijan. There will be military assistance, there will be security guarantees, there will be an alliance with the West, and you'll have the good life. From what you know, from what you observe in Europe, did anyone in Europe, on heaven or on earth, did anybody say that Armenia will become part of the European Union, it has a real chances of acceding to the European Union, that Armenia will be part of NATO or will have any kind of a military alliance with a Western power such as France or the United States, there will be some security guarantees? Did anybody say that? And how realistic do you think this is? Because it's the main propaganda tool that is used to fool and manipulate the public opinion in Armenia.
Well, I think it's nonsense, and you see this with the deals which is being made now when they meet with the United States as well. Well, the last deals which make with Biden, they're very careful to make any commitments. Again, the Western countries can't really project that much power and influence into that region. But when you speak of Armenia, again, this is why I said it can be compared with these other countries on the dividing lines of our divided Europe. And look in Georgia, how they treat the Georgians now, and they keep saying, "Oh, Georgia, it's they're run by Putinists now. They're all in the pocket of Putin." But the Georgian governments, they're saying they're anti-Western, but they're saying, "No, we want to join the EU. We make all these concessions. We made all these reforms. We want to join the EU. Please, give us an offer of membership, and we'll join." But they say what we can't do is. We can't make our country into a front line against the Russians because the Prime Minister is very open about this. He fears that the US as well as the European partners would like to see Georgia in this way, to use them as future Ukrainians, that is a second front against Russia. And they said this we can't do. But this is why it's important to see why they're being scolded now, because that is the main incentive of Georgia. Why is it such a huge interest of Georgia in the EU or NATO? Why would the Americans, the Europeans, care that much? Well, they serve a purpose, and the purpose is that we have a divided Europe, and the main objective is to strengthen the NATO bloc versus Russia. So this is the utility, and this is the same with Armenia. This is the tool. This is the role it plays, which is why it's very difficult to understand why, if Armenia is already willing to sever itself off from Iran and Russia even surrendering some territory to this extent and make it permanent, what is the purpose of bringing Armenia to NATO or the EU to begin with? It's already giving away everything that, it's the main interest of the West. So I think it's very destabilizing. Eventually, I don't think it's even in the interest of the West. This is one of the more, as I mentioned, the destructive approach to multipolarity. A more healthy multipolarity would try to make, in the border regions, the competition for influence and security less zero-sum. And in other words, countries like Armenia should be accepted as a bridge because and not as a front line. And this would have brought much more stability to Armenia as well. That is, a sovereign Armenia, a strong Armenia, prosperous, would want to connect with both the East and West. Again, that's the bridge issue. But keep in mind, that's what the Ukrainians asked for in 2013. Kiev went to Brussels. They said, listen, you're pushing these deals, which is forcing us to make a civilizational choice. If we choose between either West or Russia, then we're going to end up probably in a civil war and conflict. How about we do a trilateral deal? EU, Ukraine, Russia. This way we can be a bridge, everyone gains, and Ukraine won't be thrown into civil war, and it won't be a rivalry between the great powers. What did the EU say? Well, the EU Commission President Barroso said, no, that's not what we want. You have to choose. Anything else would be accepting a Russian sphere of influence. I don't think he knows what a sphere of influence is, because the concept of a trilateral agreement would go against the concept of a sphere of influence. But I think this is what's going on with Armenia as well. It will be an instrument. It will be a front line and a tool. So it's not going to happen. There won't be any EU. There won't be any good real security commitments either. It's
and no one has said that, right? No one has ever said that, ever, in Europe.
No.
What they're doing is they're paying their media mercenaries in Armenia to say that, but they are not saying that. And you know what's interesting? When they're using countries as bulwarks against Russia, like Ukraine and Georgia and us, perhaps, in the end, they don't even seriously commit to fighting alongside Ukrainians or Georgians. They provoke it and they run away. Like in 2008, there was a war with Georgia. The Russian army was a few kilometers away from Tbilisi, and the West did nothing. It provoked the war, but then it withdrew. In Ukraine, you can see this devastation. And even now, even after all of this, I think Zelensky is saying, would you accept the remaining part of Ukraine into NATO, from what I understand? And they said no. And then he said, well, you lied to us. Well, yeah, they did. And it is absolutely disgusting to do that. You're not even seriously committed to defending these countries. You're provoking them, using them, and then running away. I think that's the most cynical part of this.
Well, yeah, well, that's the role of the proxy, which is why I always said that when the war is over, once we've run out of Ukrainians, we will throw Ukraine under the bus. And this is how proxy wars work. Of course, we'll... And all this support for Ukraine, all this morality, there's no, all of it is why is it that every time we express some sympathy, support, or love for Ukraine, it always translates into pure horror for Ukraine? Even now that the Ukrainians want peace, we can't let them capitulate. Keep in mind, those same thing in 2019 when 73% of Ukrainians voted for this Zelensky peace platform. The main thing they did was the Americans, again, they activated all these NGOs, USA, the National Endowment for Democracy, the same people you have roaming the streets in Armenia, all of them saying, no, this is capitulation. And then, you get 10,000 people to march in the streets, and suddenly the votes of millions of people no longer matter, and Zelensky had to overturn, essentially abandon his whole peace platform. And this betrayal, I mean, this is something... I think the former advisor of Zelensky, Arestovich, he really bought into this, much like people are buying into the idea that the West will, give security guarantees, be on the side of Armenia. Arestovich, back in 2019, he was making the point, by threatening to put NATO in Ukraine, it will provoke a Russian invasion. And he called it 99% certain, because this would be an existential threat to Russia. They could never live with NATO in Ukraine. So, but by doing so, by provoking the war and Russia invading, he predicted that NATO would then come to the aid of Ukraine, and together they would defeat Russia, and he called this the coolest thing.
Who said that? Arestovich said that?
Arestovich said that back in
naive,
2019.
Very naive. Yes.
But now, of course, he changed his tune a bit. He recognizes, of course, they were lured into this. They were not meant to... they were meant to fight the Russians on behalf of the West. But this should have been obvious. Why would the Western soldiers come and fight for the Ukrainians? That was not the point of a proxy war. So now his rhetoric has changed dramatically. Now he's suggesting that the countries who didn't let us make a peace back in 2022, that is in Istanbul, they still don't let us make a peace. Even now that they lost all these men, all this territory, the country destroyed, and still those Western countries keep saying, no, well, we can't make a deal with Russia, we'll embolden them, even when the Ukrainians can't achieve anything else. And we still want to squeeze them a little bit more. It's horrific. But all of this being done in the language of sympathy and caring about them. This is what we always did. When we toppled the government back in 2014, there was no majority support for an unconstitutional removal. Even the BBC recognized this. Yet it was a pro-Ukrainian thing to do, we said. When we ignored the Minsk agreement, which most Ukrainians wanted, which they voted for, which reflected in the election, no, this capitulation, we're going to help Ukraine not to capitulate. And of course, helping Ukraine in 2022, we helped them with the counteroffensive, even when Ukrainian generals said, "Oh no, we knew this was going to be a disaster, but we were pressured by the British and American generals to carry through it anyways." They even said this in the Washington Post.
I didn't know that.
Yet to the public, we sell this as helping the Ukrainians. But this is what you do in all wars. You make a moral case for war, and this is not just the West. This is all countries. When you go to war, it has to be a moral case for it. It has to be some good versus evil. And just very briefly, in regards to all these NGOs running around in Armenia, this has been their main role. And this has been an interesting, I guess, an open secret. So now that the Americans cut the funding to them, we discovered that 85 to 90% of Ukrainian media has been financed
Yes.
by the US.
Yes.
And we call this independent. How is this independent? There's a very fierce information war going on. This is propaganda, and it's been deliberately propaganda. This is, Reagan referred to this, I think, as hiding in plain sight. That is, why do covert operation to manipulate other societies when you can just do it in the open? Call it a human rights organization. It's still a front for the CIA. They're still financed by the US government. They're staffed with people to the intelligence agencies. They still act according to US interest. And but we call them NGOs. Why? What part of this is non-governmental? But this is a way of maintaining, of being able to manipulate and control the civil society of other countries. And it's done so openly. There's been so much literature on this, from declassified documents, leaked documents, former CIA whistleblowers, the main people establishing institutions such as NED. All of this has been out in the open, but no journalist will speak of it or criticize it because, as we learned over the past 2 weeks, everyone has been on the pay.
So first of all, about the NGOs, I am all for democracy. I'm all for human rights. I'm a very liberal person, respecting people's freedom, social democracy. I love all those things. But these NGOs, that's not what they're doing. They're being selectively financed in selective countries, not in all countries, only in those countries that become a target for this kind of selective manipulation of the public opinion. And then it leads to civil war and regime change and instability and deaths, tens of thousands of deaths. And some countries in the world even said, we don't want your USAID money. Honduras said that, Mexico said that, a couple of other countries said, you know what, we don't want your democracy here because it's not democracy. And again, there are some other countries in this region that are not Western democracies, and the West is getting along swimmingly with them. Like Ms. von der Leyen has no problem going to Azerbaijan. It's not exactly a Western democracy. I mean, I don't want to put any labels on it, but she has no problem communicating with Aliyev, and she's not sponsoring any NGOs on his territory. So it's very selective. And my other comment was, when you look at these events, the President of the United States openly advocating ethnic cleansing, saying it's going to turn Palestine into Riviera. The West and Turkey and Israel bringing a terrorist, an Al-Qaeda member, to power in Syria, and then shaking his hand, giving him a makeover. When you look at, or people provoking Ukraine, not allowing Ukraine to reach a peaceful settlement in time, forcing it into this conflict, and then abandoning it, saying, sorry, we tricked you into this, now that you lost over 1 million people and almost 14 million refugees. When you look at the quality of leadership in today's world, and you look back at the end of the Cold War, at people like Gorbachev with all his faults, Margaret Thatcher, François Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, Ronald Reagan. I mean, there's a huge difference in the quality of leadership, in intelligence, in foresight, in wisdom. I just don't know how to explain it because I remember those years. And I have the impression that somebody kidnapped me and I live on a different planet now. It's a comment. I mean, you may comment if you like. If I may ask my last question, you've been incredibly generous with your time. President Trump secured the release of some certain hostages from Hamas, which is great. And of course, there was a barbaric attack in October of last year, which we all condemn. So now we have Armenian prisoners of war in Baku. Some of them were supposed to be released according to the peace agreement, but they're not. And our Catholicos has appealed to President Trump, asking him to assist in securing their release. I know that this may not be your field of expertise, but in your opinion, do you think that there is any chance that we can get President Trump to help us release our POWs?
Well, let me just first address the NGO question, living in a different world, and then get over to the hostages, because I more or less agree, and I would advise people to read this interview by Friedman of George Kennan, the political or diplomatic titan, if you will, of the United States, who was interviewed back in '98 in the New York Times, and there was some similar remarks there that this is really an age where we need political giants. We have to reorganize the entire security system. We can't just this side is weak, let's do more bloc politics. It's all this just a very aggressive instinct. So, and I think this is a problem, and this is a problem also of political ideology. That is, we very much bought into this idea of perpetual peace. As long as the West can dominate everything, then this will allow liberal democratic values to thrive, and this is the source of perpetual peace. Anything else would mean return to destructive power politics, and this results this assumption that that if we can only cross this bridge by making sure that our adversaries are defeated, then we can transcend the realism of the past and the great power rivalry and get a completely different world. Now, once you think that this bridge can be crossed, then you're willing to do some very gruesome things in order to achieve it, and it excuses a lot of things. So, but. In terms of the NGOs, I think it simply got lost. I think this is why Trump also is cutting them, because it's not that he wouldn't mind some soft power instruments to subvert the democracies and the civil society of other countries. I think it's just that they took on what they refer to as a deep state, a life of their own. They get the funding, they're not accountable. They've begun to take on political agendas, which doesn't necessarily reflect his interests. So he didn't want a war in Ukraine. He doesn't think it's a good idea to topple Orban or these kind of things. So I think they aren't serving his purpose. So even USAID, I don't think it necessarily wants to get rid of it completely, but as Marco Rubio said, they have to be reporting to him essentially. So so draining the deep state, not necessarily giving up the tools. So this is a very important difference. But again, it's very destructive, because keep in mind that at the end of the 1980s, a lot of the countries living in communist countries, they look towards the West. Here they have all this open society, freedom,
Yes.
and they want to emulate this, and good, because I think this proved to be much healthier societies as opposed to one that kept their populations down. So this was positive, but we've seen that a lot of the institution which allegedly should promote democracy, they're now becoming so dependent on translating this into geopolitical rivalry that they betray all the basic ideas and freedoms which they wanted. So, the Georgians, they vote for the wrong government. They want some laws for transparency on NGOs, which Western countries have as well. And suddenly they have to be toppled. And we want regime change. And we have these NGOs also here in Norway, which are financed also by National Endowment for Democracy, the US State Department, and they do the same. When they see Georgians voting the wrong way, they turn on the idea that, they are not legitimate anymore, they have to be removed. And so it's and I often made this point as well. You have these NGOs, just as a symptom, they have shown no interest, for example, in what Julian Assange revealed about human rights abuses, but they're very eager in smearing him. So again, this is when you see that hegemony and liberal democracy no longer go hand in hand with these institutions, when they instead use liberal democracy and abuse it and weaken it in order to advance power interest. So just a quick note, we have these institutions also here in Norway. We have the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. It's one of the same NGOs. It's financed by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is this CIA cutout, which Reagan established in 1983, is financed by the U.S. Foreign Ministry, and of course by my own government as well. And they do the same. They, in every conflict, especially now in Ukraine, they're very worried. They speak the language of human rights and concerns. Yet all concerns are always translated into more weapons, no diplomacy, no negotiations. Again, Putin is Hitler, which means the diplomacy is appeasement, and we have to win on the battlefield. It's very strange remarks for a human rights organization. And for me, who's been very critical of it, to seeing the disaster playing out now, for at least since 2008. But that's again, right. I was very worried ever since the Orange Revolution 2004. I've been warning about this. So, what does this human rights organization do? Well, they have this continuous intimidation. They, not just the tweets and the almost weekly now with smears, which I try to shame my university as well. They also have these smear pieces. They write articles in the newspapers calling me a Russian propagandist.
Right.
And again, any time a Norwegian media wants to know what's going on in Ukraine, they, not every time, but they usually often go to these NGOs, because they just have altruistic goals.
It's exactly the same. I'm sorry to jump in. It's exactly the same here. I have been called Putin's agent for saying that the expansion of NATO was not a good idea. In fact, I wrote it in the mid-1990s possibilities, saying that it would lead to war in eastern Ukraine. 30 years ago, I've written about it. So now I am Putin's agent. And yes, you're absolutely right. They go to other experts. They say silence you. They forbid foreign journalists from talking to me. This government, this regime, forbids French and American journalists from talking to me. I had to leave my university. They took my courses away from me. This is how democracy works, in case you were curious. So it's exactly the same thing here.
Yeah. No, and then this is how it works. And again, this is my point as well. And I always consider it to be a very pro-Ukrainian argument to say, if we go forward here, this is an existential threat to Russia. If we try to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit, Russia will destroy it. They cannot accept this. Yes. They will either annex the territory, and whatever they don't take of relevance, they will rather destroy it and let it end up in the hands of NATO. This is not a statement of support for destroying. It's just a recognition. And I made the comparison. It would be like trying to pull Mexico into a Chinese alliance. It wouldn't be pro-Mexican argument, because Americans would destroy Mexico, bomb every city before they would let them become a front line for the Chinese. Yes. But this is not a statement of support or legitimizing anything. It's just recognizing this. Yeah. This is what's going to happen. And even though I'm correct, it shows, well, you're seen as supporting Russia's narrative. That's what Putin says, I said from day one, the sanctions cannot work, because this is one of my main focuses of study, is when Russia reorganizes economy to the east. Oh, well, you're trying to undermine the trust in the sanctions. Right, no, objective reality means something. And I knew that this wouldn't go work. Because I looked at the supply chains, I looked at the banks they're using, I looked at the technologies, I looked at the transportation corridors, all those things. So it was obvious that this wasn't going to work. But still, these people, this human rights organization, they keep calling the head of the university here. They're sending letters, calling me a Russian agent.
All right, the same here, exactly the same.
Yeah, what happened to you then? But they do the same. They even advocate for other academics to go against me, because it's time to take a stand against Professor Diesen. Whenever I have speaking events, they do the same. They try to they try to get me disinvited. They try to cancel the events. And even what's most vulgar is because when all this is happening, I start to get more emails, phone calls from public who thinks, they think what they read in the paper is real, that I'm some kind of a Russian agent.
Yep.
And so I spoke with the police. They said, okay, just have your phone number removed and your address, everything. And this one employee at the Norwegian Helsinki committee even posts a picture of my house on social media. I mean, it's so beyond disgusting. And
the same methods are used against me. The same methods are used against me. And I'm so sorry to cut you off, but when I was a boy and I grew up in the Soviet Union, I was listening to BBC, Voice of America, even though it was dangerous to do that. If they found out, I would be in a lot of trouble. And I would listen to Radio Liberty at night and I unconditionally trusted the West. I believed in democracy. I believed in the liberal society. But now, after what happened, like the last few years, and after how I was treated by the so-called democratic liberal society for expressing my views and expressing them in a very moderate manner. I'm not saying that I am for the war in Ukraine. I'm just saying this was wrong. The expansion of NATO was wrong. I was attacked exactly the same as you were. So my unconditional faith in Western liberalism kind of disappeared.
And this was my argument once the Russians invaded as well, because I said, well, this is an existential threat to Russia. They will fight this to the end. And so I said the Western policy, that is to first sabotage the negotiation in Istanbul and then say, we're not going to have any negotiations or diplomacy with Russia. And once the war is over, we defeated Russia on the battlefield, Ukraine going to join NATO. I mean, this is what lunacy. Was the only thing that could happen here? We said whoever survives will get to determine. So it's a war of attrition, which means the only thing Russia could get, it can either capitulate what it sees as an existential threat, or it could essentially destroy, which is a war of attrition, destroy and bleed out the entire Ukrainian army. And now the same NGOs are walking around, look, with their bleeding hearts at pretending to care about what happened to Ukraine. Of course it happened. It doesn't mean that the Russians are innocent in this. Again, their soldiers, their bombs. But we cut off every single avenue to peace since 2014. Every avenue has been cut off. We said for years the only peaceful approach to peace in Ukraine was the Minsk agreement. At the same time, we undermined what was the only path to peace.
And admitted to it. And admitted to it.
And admitted to it. Yeah. And still, it all goes under the big umbrella of, oh no, we're supporting the Ukrainians, we're helping them against the new Hitler. It's absurd. It's beyond absurd. But again, I'm sorry to hear he got pushed out of academia. I'm
the same
acquiring
thing.
another citizenship myself at the moment, because I'm at least get my ducks in order before I make any decisions. But
oh dear.
But it's just it's beyond ridiculous, and this is not an open society. To have this again, George Soros open society, is such a
travesty.
Contradiction in terms.
It's a travesty.
Yeah, travesty.
By the way, send them to William Burns, because he also said that Ukraine's membership in NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian political elite. He is now the head of CIA, so apparently Putin is running the CIA. I have news for our friends at the NGOs.
But he also had the memo "Niet means Niet," where he said, if we try to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit, there will be civil war, and the Russians would intervene. They said something they wouldn't want to do. But again, he's also apparently a Putin puppet.
Everybody is
by this logic. But again, nothing matters here anymore. It's when a journalist is going to write something about me, what I've said, they don't. I had the former, not that long ago, the former CIA director of Russia analysis. He says on camera that he follows my analysis, and he likes it. Okay, so this is the former CIA director of Russia analysis. Do they cite him, the media here? No, they go to these NGOs who are financed to
which hand is the term?
To explain to the reader why I'm an agent of the Russians. I mean, it's so absurd, and they all do this under this moralistic language and pretending to care about democracy. It's disgusting, and it's shutting down free
speech, free analysis. Anyway, Professor, you've been incredibly generous. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this is not our last conversation. And hang in there. I think the times will change, and this witch hunt and this Spanish Inquisition will stop, and we'll be able to express our opinion freely as they pretend to want us to do. Thank you very much indeed.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.